Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I will just, I can see people are dropping in right now. So I will just let them have one more minute. So we're all here.
Yeah.
Good morning, Sophia, John, Lina, Niklas. Nice to see you. We have Tina and Ole with us as well. Okay. So let's just get started. Welcome to this webinar, the consultancy industry's favorite KPIs. We have a lot of people attending today, and we are really excited that you all want to share this little knowledge seance we have. With us, my name is Andreas. With us today, we have Sasha Skydsgaard, who's our Chief Sales Officer, and we have Søren Lund, who founded TimeLog. And between them, they have more than 40 years of experience working with KPIs, especially for our customers who are primarily consultancy businesses. Before I hand over the mic to you, Søren, just a practical note. If you have any questions, you can use the chat to the right. I will try to answer as best as I can, but if it's something that needs a little bit more elaboration, we will take the questions at the end, because we have a bit of a tight schedule today. We have a lot of things packed and ready for you. And before you ask, you will all receive the webinar by mail 1 hour after the webinar. Okay, so without further ado, I'll pass over the mic to Søren Lund so we can get the show on the road.
Thank you, Andreas, and welcome everybody to today's webinar, where we're going to talk about the consultancy industry's favorite KPIs. It's thrilling to see that we actually had 136 sign-ups for this webinar this time, which was all-time record for TimeLog. So happy to have so many interesting in this. And also fantastic to see that almost 60 have managed to also attend today and share the next 45 minutes with Sasha and me going into the topic. I hope you'll get a joyful ride, but also hope you'll get some concrete takeaways that you can take back home in your companies and get it working there. Before we jump into today's first topic, a short agenda here, we're going to look into 3 different things today on the overall level. First of all, we talk a bit about why we have KPIs, where did they come from, and how do they actually attach into, you can say, management life, but also how do they also need to get vitalized again and again. Then we jump into a poll where we're going to listen or get some information from you guys about which types of KPIs you're actually using out there. Nice to share and fun to see. We of course have some ideas where you will hit the most, because we have done this webinar before. But let's see what happens today. Then we do a deep dive into 5 what we call what we think are the most relevant or very relevant KPIs for the consultancy industry 2021. And deep dive into how are they structured, what impact do they have, who would usually own these KPIs, and so on in the organization. And then we close the day by talking a bit about how do we actually bring these KPIs into practicalities or practical work in the daily life in a company, also using some examples from TimeLog. At the end of the day, small surprise or small extra that you will get, that we will disclose when we get there, about an interesting topic or an interesting KPI that you could put on top of everything. So that was a cliffhanger, but let's get to it and start with the first topic of the day. Why talk about KPIs? First of all, when you talk about KPIs, most of you that have been in business, maybe also for some years, have heard some sentences that go along with KPIs all the time. The first we often hear is, you can't manage what you can't measure. Now, this is a sentence that was actually invented by Peter Drucker, which is known as the founding father of modern management back in the 60s. He stated this, where he basically say that if you don't know what you do from measuring it, then it's basically hard to manage anything. So you need to get some measurements up and running on the most important things in your business, and you need to have that as the foundation of your whole decision process in the company. But when you then start setting up your KPIs, then yeah, you could have a complex business having many KPIs you maybe measure on. In Sandok, we were up to having 30 KPIs, I think, last year, but it's a bit less this year. But when you set up all the KPIs so that you can manage your company, then the sidetrack that you could also get is that you get what you measure, which is the second sentence you often hear, meaning, okay, if I put focus on these 4 KPIs in my company, then all the employees and the whole company will start focusing very much on being successful in those 4, and that will leave other important stuff behind. So when you set up KPIs, and when we talk about KPIs, always be aware that you need to balance between you would like to measure, and on the other hand, don't measure on the wrong things or too much, because those two might not, if you don't balance them, it can be actually a problem to introduce KPIs in a, if you can say in a very large way in your company. So with those 2 sentences in mind, then we enter the topic. But before we go a bit further, then what is a KPI standing for? The abbreviation of KPI is basically a key performance indicator. Key performance indicator is a measurable value that demonstrates how effectively a company is achieving key business objectives. So from this sentence, you can say KPIs needs to be measurable. So that's the first thing we look into when we talk about KPIs. How can we actually measure this? What is the way we measure this? How often do we measure? What is the formula around it? But also, you can say digitally, how do we actually get access to the data to measure the KPI? That's quite important when we talk about the KPIs, how to actually measure it, both the model and maybe also the technicalities. Then, of course, we need to have KPIs that demonstrates how we achieve key business objectives. So KPIs needs to have focus on things that we need to have focus on. So good KPIs attached to the current situation in the business. What is the current focus? Now, when we talk about KPIs, I usually put it into a stack like this pyramid here, where we have delivery KPIs as one big bucket at the bottom. And the delivery KPIs are KPIs related to how we deliver our services. It could be number of support tickets we receive, how long time it takes to staff projects, what is the quality of work that we deliver, what is the feedback from the clients on our deliveries, for example. These can be KPIs that very much tie to how we deliver our services. On top of that, we have business KPIs. And business KPIs are usually KPIs related to sales, marketing, and finance. So these KPIs are usually a bit fewer and focused on how we actually perform from a commercial standpoint. Number of new deals we have got, number of leads produced last month, profit margin last month, things like that are usually KPIs we put into the business KPI stack. On top of this, we have what I mentioned as the North Star KPI, the cliffhanger for the end of the webinar today, where we see more and more in the product industry where we are. And in Silicon Valley, it was invented, but we see the North Star KPI coming up as kind of the single KPI that defines if we are successful for everybody around us in our stakeholder community. But I will return to that a bit later on this webinar and hope you will find that also interesting to dig into. Now, KPIs do not go alone, and throughout the years, KPIs and management models often have had, you can say, a pair life in the companies. The modern management is usually defined as starting around 50 years ago in the 60s, where Peter Drucker launched a new book about the effective executive. And in that book, he stated a lot about how do we actually manage a company in the modern world, but also how do we measure while we manage. And the first model that came up there was management by objectives, MBO, that had, you can say, 20 years in operation around in the companies before it was taken over by what we call SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely is the abbreviations we have here, where we look into a model where we set goals for the company, and the goals have to be so smart and so well thought that people are attracted to follow those goals and achieve them. That matured a bit into, you can talk into the KPI world, which arrived in the 80s, where we started to talk a bit about KPIs as the term we use for this. But quickly thereafter, in around 2000, OKR, objectives, key results, came as the management model, which is you can say the most dominating model we see right now in the market, and which is also the model that Timeout is actually using. And in OKR, if we take that as an example for today, we talk about lead measures and lag measures. Lead measures are measures where we set up goals for the company that has a future perspective, meaning what would we like to achieve the next quarter or the next year. So objectives here are things that are motivating and inspiring for the company. And then we have lag measures in that model, which is where the KPIs arrive. So lag measures is looking backwards and look at how did we actually perform on the things we find important. So the KPIs are documenting and reacting and warning and lead to corrective actions, you can say, while the lead measures drive people by motivation towards a common goal. So we need the KPIs still, even though models have changed over the years, a bit away from just looking at KPIs and hit specific targets and into motivation, inspiration, then still KPIs are there. Our KPIs are not static. You could say, okay, we set a strategy. Now we have our company, it's a consulting business. We have 4 KPIs that are important for this company. It's utilization, it's billability, it's maybe revenue growth and so on. And then we just go forward. But the truth is KPIs should live and follow the strategy, the people we have in the company, the trends in the market, and so on. And if you look at drivers that by definition make you have to reevaluate your KPIs. For example, a company size. If you're a small company, usually you don't work with KPIs in depth because the way you align and go forward is simply by having a meeting, talk together, decide what to do, go ahead. That's how the small company, the startup will look at this. But sooner, when you get bigger, here visualized by cubicles and maybe a bit drastic. But when you get into companies have maybe more geographical locations, more teams, maybe more tiers in your leadership model from the CEO into team leaders and so on, then suddenly you have a lot of the risks of sub-optimizing. And then you need to have a KPI framework that corresponds to that, meaning you have to have balanced KPIs that ensure that the whole company from outside in operates in the right direction. So here there is a need for a change. Another change you will often see changing KPIs is what I call the KPI creep situation. Or at least where you have to evaluate it, because you might set up goals for the company. Then you see that you go in the right direction. Everybody have been trained, and now we go towards this goal all together with the KPIs supporting that. But over time, when these KPIs flow down into the organization, then different teams, different countries, different needs and roles start adding maybe sub-KPIs that somehow supports their role and somehow should basically align to the top KPIs or the overall perspective. But usually we see that this has a tendency to sidetrack. So suddenly when you look into the KPIs on delivery level, they are not tied directly into the business KPIs or even the North Star KPI. So you have to evaluate from time to time if the KPIs you use in operations is also aligned with the KPIs that you think is the strategy KPIs on top. The third situation that triggers reevaluation is this. You have a plan that you make in the board, you go to leadership team, or you make it in leadership team, and then you decide this is the plan forward. You communicate it to the company and everybody say, yes, now we go in that direction, and they plan and do their things and go forward. Then decisions are made on leadership team level maybe, or up in the organization that we are going to change towards a new direction, meaning basically other KPIs becomes relevant. We often see that in this case, the KPI metrics in the company is not evaluated in the same speed the strategy is actually changing. And then suddenly we have KPIs that are not supporting the strategy we have. So in this case, also take care, go back, look at your KPI overview of what are the things you measure and ensure that they follow the strategy. And with these words, over to you, Sasha.
Thank you. So now after this introduction to what is a KPI and different measurement models and so on, we will go into a more deep dive on the KPIs. What you see here is what we call our KPI board, and there must be a lot of other KPIs out there that we could put on, or there is, but these are some of the ones that we see most often and that we discuss with our customers. you could also look at it as a bingo card. So you could print this afterwards and then start seeing which of the ones you're actually using in organization, or are there some of these that you would like to look deeper into. But let's quickly go through the tops. So we have the classic KPIs. You can't really talk about a consultancy organization without going through at least some of these KPIs and use those as your benchmark in the organization about how you're performing. When you're on track with those, or you have those in place and you start having to measure them on a regular basis and you can use those as navigation, we start seeing some of the occasional KPIs coming in. Because when you look at the classic KPIs, you start asking some questions about what's behind this, or what is the result of this, and how do these work together. And then we start seeing that you evolve in your company and use other KPIs. When we go to the rare KPIs, we actually think these are quite overlooked because they can be very beneficial for you to take into consideration, and perhaps just one of them, take one for 1 year and start focusing on that, because it can really tell you a lot about how you're working and the performance you're driving right now. But before we reveal the 5 KPIs we are looking into today, we actually prepared a small poll just to see which of the KPIs you're using today. So I've just launched a poll. I hope you can see it, and I'm very eager to see which of the ones are you using out in the organization today. Can you see it now? Because I don't see that many answers so far. Yeah, it starts coming in. And it is some of the KPIs that we have on the basic line that we start seeing moving upwards, that are the foundation of them. And I can reveal afterwards the top 3 from last year that was in focus, where we can see now it's average hourly rate and utilization that are in the forefront. And I can say that's also some of the ones we're going to talk about today, and then also one of the more rare ones. One that's not really been clicked yet is the investment percentage, which could actually be quite interesting and is actually some of the ones we don't see that much, but it's also looking into your internal time and how much you're actually investing that into growing your organization or developing your strategy, developing new business areas. And when you are in a consultancy industry, of course, it is utilization, billability you're looking a lot into, but it could perhaps be interesting for you also to look into that and see, okay, for the future, how much are we investing in growing that for next year? Last year, I will reveal it now, we saw on the first place was revenue per consultant, then it was billability and utilization. And today I can actually see that average hourly rate is taking the front compared to last year. So interesting to see if there's been a change in the way we work also now with COVID-19, or it's just a coincidence. But let's go through some of the KPIs that we're talking for today. We are looking into the supply chain for a consultancy organization, and we are starting out with hold on to our talents with employee NPS. It might be seen as a softer KPI, but actually it's very important, especially for consultancy organizations, to keep the talent and attract talent. It's difficult to go out and hire, and it takes a long time, but we will get into that. Then we go into looking into, okay, we have all our talent. Are we utilizing the capacity? So what is the backlog percentage at quarterly start? One KPI that we don't see that much, but actually is part of the maturity in organization to be on top of that KPI when you get into the quarter. And then, of course, we couldn't have this without utilization. So we will go deeper into, are we actually using the resources we have? And at the end, the average hourly rate that a lot of you are also using already, but perhaps we can inspire some of you to dig deeper into this one. So do you actually earn money on the work you're doing? Underneath, you can see we have KPI number 5, and we put that in as one of the KPIs that are quite overlooked, but it's actually quite important for your entire KPI frame to look at the data quality. Can you trust the KPIs you're measuring? We see some examples out there that you think you are on the top of the KPI, but when we start digging into the data that you have, it actually shows you different things when you go in and correct that. But let's start with the KPI number 1. So employee NPS. It is on the top of the list for 2021. We have seen a huge change, and I know a lot of you have also done that about what is with COVID-19 that you're remote. And as you can also see here, we have a survey saying that on-site delivery has gone down from 58% in 17 to 41% in 2020. It's based in the SPI benchmark that we're also talking a lot about in TimeLog, which is recognized as the most thorough study in the consulting industry. So it's quite interesting to see in a year or two if that will go further down. Then also many struggle right now to keep the workforce motivated. We also see that millennials are moving between jobs much more often than they used to, and COVID has accelerated this. And the process of losing one good consultant and hire another one is very expensive, and that's why we also moved employee NPS up to the top of the list to 21. Last year, when we had this webinar, we also saw that 14% was measuring on employee churn, which is quite connected to employee NPS. And right now, it's only 2% of the participants that are using this. So it might be also something to look into in the future. But let's start this way. We will go through the KPIs in this way. So what do I measure? We will start with, on a basic level, you of course measure the well-being of your employees. But what you're really measuring is also whether you're in risk of losing your best talent, because they are the first ones to go. And because you need to do this in a structured way, not only by chatting by the coffee maker, which is also quite difficult right now, so it will be over Teams, you're measuring the development of your employees' well-being, the level of content, and ultimately their motivation to deliver. So the commercial impact, it's all about loss prevention. Almost every company and employee is in a new position in 2021, and you need to keep track of how they're coping with this so you don't risk losing the talent. Research shows that 10% at least of an average company's base salary expenses goes to recruitment and onboarding, and it takes an average of 120 days from recruitment start to an employee starting to be productive. So that's a heavy cost right now on your base salary budget. And at the end, when you start measuring NPS and you have a high one, the bird is spreading. Companies with high NPS tend to have easier in recruiting the talents because everyone wants to work for a place with happy employees that creates the great results. One of the required processes is that, first of all, you need a good tool to help you measure this. And eNPS should not stand alone, but be supported by sub-metrics in the tool like relationship with your peers, manager, especially right now, the work-life balance, personal growth, and so on. Also, it should not be measured once or twice a year. Look at it as a temperature measurement where you can quickly see if the temperature drops all of a sudden due to changes in the organization, society, like we see right now. And then you can act fast, but not if you're told 3 months after a change and people start leaving. So you also need to talk about it from top management. You need to be open and share the results. You should include the people in the journey and decide what you should work on together. Are there some pinpoints in the different measurement and metrics that we should work on together? Because this will also give the employees an incentive to answer and be honest, and it will help you change your culture. Which leads me into the cultural impact. Obviously, it's by bringing well-being in focus. A leadership that takes the well-being seriously will also impact this employee's sense of ownership to the company, and they will start go the extra mile if they feel appreciated. Often negative NPS is not just based on salary or whether you like your boss or not. It often comes down to how well internal processes are working and if you're overloaded or overlooked. So employee NPS will make these things surface and help you develop a healthy and high-performing organization with efficient processes and delivery. The ownership of this, it can be in many places in the organization because it requires for all the organization. But we usually see that it starts in the HR department by defining the tool and the metrics, and also make sure that we keep on track with the measurements and the people respond. But it's actually all line managers, and now when we talk about consultants, it's head of consulting to be responsible for the well-being of the employees. But it also needs to be on the agenda for the CEO. It has to come from the top and also be that in the discussions in general in the company to make a difference. So that was KPI number 1.
And then to KPI number 2. And one of the KPIs we actually have for this webinar is to be done in time. So we will try to be efficient and meet it to the timeline 10:45. So KPI number 2, that is backlog percentage at quarter start. I saw in the poll that only one actually answered that they use this, but I think it's a quite important KPI to consider in your business. First of all, what do you measure when you measure backlog percentage at quarter start? Yeah, of course, you measure when you start a quarter, how much do we have in planned work for the company when we get into the quarter. It has many different side effects of focusing on that, but first and foremost, to ensure that we early on look into the next quarter and ensure we have what we need to have in order to meet our business objectives. The commercial impact from running this KPI is very financial, you can say. First and foremost, if you get people in and get them planned, not get people in, but get the quarter planned early, get the orders in early, then you plan for a well-performed quarter, and that naturally usually will drive more revenue. It also drives higher profit margins, simply because when you have people working with a better planning on the right slot for the different clients, and you have used the full capacity, then you also get to higher profit because hours not with clients is, as you know, in your businesses, costs lost basically. So we need to get people on commercial tasks, but it also drives more ad biz, because if you have a target to hit a certain percentage at quarter start and you are not there, then the organization would naturally look for how can we find business that we can put into this quarter to meet our objectives from different sources, and not only new biz but also maybe ad biz to different clients. Required processes to run this KPI, first and foremost, project management, because if you don't have project management, you don't know what is to be done in the quarter. And if you don't know that, then you can't plan it well. So first of all, we need to have project managers that plan well a quarter ahead, which tasks are to be done when, but also get the clients to attach to the plan so that they don't sidetrack what you just planned because they didn't deliver their part. Pipeline management is also key because if you don't have a sales thinking that early looks into what do we have now in the books that can hit a high percentage in the quarter start, then we'll get in trouble when we start to optimize this figure, because we don't have enough deals in the pipeline that we can put into the backlog for that quarter. Resource management is, of course, also key. It doesn't make sense to not look into who can actually are the different resources that take all the work so that they are the bottleneck and others do not have enough to do, some on vacation and so on. We need to be sure we have a well-planned quarter to get to high percentages from the start. Otherwise, we'll get lost time in between different tasks when we switch. Cultural impact. Yeah, what we usually see is that this KPI drives a sales culture, because you get very high focus on do we have enough in when the quarter starts, and then call back to sales and marketing if you have that in your teams, or the consultants themselves to reach out, build more business so that we can get this percentage on the target we have set. It also drives, I would say, a production thinking, because you start looking at your business a bit more like, we have a capacity, we have to utilize that capacity, we have to have things planned for the coming quarter in due time to do so. Early warnings is also a good thing. Usually you will see that KPIs like this will drive that you earlier on find out that this quarter we go into now is in trouble, and that you earlier on start doing corrective actions. Ownership on this, usually head of sales or head of consulting, or those two together, to drive the right behavior towards this KPI. And over to the next one, KPI number 3, Sasha.
Yes, utilization, and it was in your top 3 in this poll. So this is, if not one of the most used KPIs. So what do you measure? It's very simple, actually. It's consultants that should be customer-oriented and are the basis for creating revenue. The commercial impact is that if you're not having a high utilization, you're not reaching the budgeted revenue. So if you have a lot of resources with a low utilization, it's important to look into the reasons behind. Is it because they're actually helping colleagues too much to reach their utilization percentage? Or do you not have enough in pipeline, as Søren just mentioned, at quarterly start? So you actually need to warm up each quarter to find new tasks? Or is it because you're spending a lot of resources internally on projects? And it might be a strategic choice you've done that, but you need to be aware of that when you measure this KPI. The reasons can be many, and it's really one we discuss a lot with you guys out there, and it's so interesting to hear all your opinions when we talk about this, because it is your guide to dig into what you should change to get back on track with this. So the required processes, calculation method. I don't know if you tried it, but if you Google utilization, you will see that there are so many ways of calculating this KPI. And it's also one of the things we discussed with you is that how do you actually measure this KPI? So do you define it by billable hours compared to the norm time, or is it just customer hours compared to norm time? And then we get to the next question, how do you define norm time? Is it including or excluding vacation, sickness, education hours, etc.? And why is that? Why have you done these choices? Then also you need to track all hours. Yes, we still see some companies that doesn't really care about the internal hours, but it will give you a false positive if you have a high utilization based on your norm time, if you're not tracking all of the hours on internal projects. So you think you have a high utilization, but you have a lot of people that can be overheated with work because they're also spending time on internal projects, which leads to the cultural impact. There can be friction between teams when you start really focusing on utilization, what Søren also went into in the beginning about how you work with the KPIs in the organization. Because if you as a consultant has a high target of utilization, you might say no to a lot of actually quite important internal projects that is for the future growth that you will say no to because you need to keep your higher utilization. And it can also show you if employees are close to burning out. So if they have a very high utilization over a period, it should be something that you should look into together with the ENPS I talked about earlier and see if there's a plan for these employees. The ownership, it definitely almost lies with the head of consulting to keep track of this and find corrective actions, whether it's too high or too low.
Then to KPI number 4, thank you, Sasha. Average hourly rate, actually the highest scoring KPI in our poll. So it looks like that you have it all under control on this one, but let's see if there are some takeaways you can use here also. First of all, what do we measure with the average hourly rate? Yeah, that's the actual value of the employee's work. It's quite natural. What we see is usually that average hourly rate is the one we measure the most, but do we measure it in a way that it's actually generic and can be used across all the business models in your company? I usually see many companies where the model works, but not on all settlements. So if you have retainers running with some clients, you have fixed price projects, you might have fixed price projects where parts of the project have fixed revenue into it that you need to control. You have time material, you have prepaid hours. Then to have all this to get into one figure, the average hourly rate, might give you some trouble in the data collection and the reporting. But that's what we think is important to make it work really well. The commercial impact of this KPI is obviously higher profitability in projects. If you have a high average hourly rate, and of course also a cost base which is attached to that makes good sense, then you have a profit on the hour which is high, which brings you also high profitability in your projects. It also leads to tighter budget control, because in particular on fixed price projects, this figure will identify when you're not in control with your budget, and will make you early on also align with the client if you are working outside scope and need more money or need to reduce scope to keep the average hourly rate. It might have a side effect that utilization goes down, simply because when you optimize an average hourly rate, then you will see that if that's more important, then why not only take the good deals and then accept the people on the bench a bit more. So usually what we see is to have the average hourly rate and the utilization working as a pair KPI makes a very strong control. Required processes, average hourly rate requires budgeting, at least if you run also on fixed price, because fixed price projects define budgets, and budgets define how far we are in a project from a completion perspective. The completion perspective gives you how much revenue you have produced, and from there you can calculate the average hourly rate on fixed price. On time material, of course, a bit less important, but still also an indicator if you can keep the average hourly rate later on. Revenue recognition is also good to control the things you have closed are locked money-wise, so you only look at average hourly rate right now with the remaining money and the remaining things to be done. Then you can, of course, evaluate for the full project, for example, when it ends. Detailed contract management, again, don't do just time material in everything you do and then just fix things on invoices, because then you only get the average hourly rate when you invoice the client, and that's too late if you would like to have corrective actions. Cultural impact, this KPI leads to a commercial mindset, but also to staff projects right, but also to ensure that we always work within the scope we have decided with the client. It also gives a transparent business, because we can actually compare across any kind of dimension structure you would like in the company to see if we actually earn money on different things, and also structures around different business parts or business areas being worse than others, but times of year being worse than others, and so on. Then the average hourly rate is very good for that indication. And project management and consultants take responsibility in fixed price projects simply because they are getting the information earlier. Ownership, head of finance, head of consulting. So what other things with this, what we call the power KPI, then average hourly rate, that I would like to state here is, first of all, it's independent of dimensions, it's independent of business models, it's also able to produce in real-time forecasts, and actually TimeLog is able to support you in that. So small commercial, sorry for TimeLog here, that we can do this as you go along on the day, which is very powerful. Then to KPI number 5, data quality. Data quality is the foundation of KPIs, as you saw in my starting point around what you can't manage, what you can't measure. So data quality is key here. When you have your KPIs, you need to know if the KPIs you have are based on true data. And since most data is time registrations made by people, and time tracking usually is a process that has some hard times in some companies, then you need to ensure this process is very strong. Otherwise, all the KPIs based on time at least gets less trustworthy. The commercial impact of having high data quality is you get more revenue because you trust the data and react earlier. You get a stronger backlog percentage, because when you see how much time you have really spent and also what is the situation, then you can also in a better way move your targets towards commercial tasks for the next quarter. Better negotiations with clients. Good data is the best tool to get higher average hourly rates and money for your work, because you can basically document what is the comprehensiveness of your services. Required processes to have a good data quality. First of all, get people to close their timesheets at the minimum weekly, but some actually also do it daily. Also require people to track time ongoingly as they go along throughout the day. So check the quality of the data, check the data, how late people are in actually delivering the time on the work they've done, because the more time they spend to track time on a job, the less quality you get. Cultural impact. Yeah, when we trust data, we start navigating from data. So that's the first and foremost cultural change. But also we focus on how time is spent much more than we would do else, because now we trust the data. and we have to put it in a detailed way, then we get a much more clear picture of what was the situation of yesterday. But also a risk of pro forma time tracking, because if you want to track time quickly and right ahead and in real time, then some users have a tendency to actually start just doing it because they're told to, and it becomes data you can't trust. So then, of course, you need to check quality. Ownership, yeah, head of finance or the CEO, head of HR are usually owners of this KPI. Over to you, Sasha.
Yeah, so now we've been through the 5 KPIs for today. So it's not enough just to talk about them, but how do you actually get them to work for you? So in TimeLog, we have our own set of KPIs underneath the work we're doing with the OKR, as Søren mentioned earlier today. So what you will receive afterwards is a very simple Excel sheet. We call it a target sheet with the KPIs we've gone through today, where we've gone through with the owner, the goal, just set as a goal, and then very important, the goal definition. How can you measure this target? So it's kind of a starter KPI tracking set that you will receive afterwards and work further with. Just remember what Søren also said, that you need to evaluate each year, are these still the right KPIs for us to measure on, or should we move some of them out of the set here? Then we go to the organizational ownership and the collaboration. Again, this is actually some from our internal work in TimeLog also, to visualize how we're working with KPIs and OKR, that we need an alignment between the teams, and also having it go all the way from the bottom and up to the top, and then vice versa. So we are aligned and we go against the KPI creep that we talked about earlier, where we see departments or teams working against each other with different KPIs that sub-optimize underneath their way of working, but actually is not beneficial for the overall company goal. You see the line from employee and all the way up to the customers. And this is where we will end up today, talking about the North Star KPI, which is the KPI that you can actually share openly with your customers and have a really good discussion. It's a win-win KPI. That's not just something you have internally, but you can actually have a really good dialogue with your customer about this. So that leads me to your closing, Søren.
And that is the North Star. So sorry for taking you outside what is usual in the consulting industry in this closing comment about KPIs, because the North Star KPI honestly is not very common in the consulting industry. It's a KPI thinking that comes from product companies and actually was originating from Silicon Valley and very much tied into how users interact with you as a company and very much into business to consumer. But if you look at these North Star KPIs, they actually can be very motivating also from a consulting perspective if we could find a way to think of this also. If we look at what a North Star KPI then is, it is a KPI that brings equal value for you and for your customer. So it's not like revenue growth, which mainly brings value to yourself. It's something that really motivates the customer and make them happy while you also get happy. If we look at some of the companies in the market and how they work with the North Star matrix, being product companies. For example, Facebook, monthly active users, meaning if we have many active users, it means the users get value from adding data into the system and communicate with each other. It means that the advertisers get happy because many users on the platform makes advertisement also a good tool to use. And at the same time for Facebook, if you are very much in a platform, then it means that you're sticky, you stay there, you have your life there. That means it's a hard time to leave, you get a long-term relationship. And North Star KPI is very much about getting a long-term relationship with your clients. And that is also very valid for a consulting industry to consider. If we look at how North Star KPI is built quickly, then and what it is, then here you can see an illustration that just gives you some ideas. Basically, what we talked about earlier on is we have business KPIs and we have delivery KPIs here in the middle. These KPIs are very internal in the organization and it's something we measure to understand how we perform and be able to do corrective actions. Now, the North Star KPI and metric is a delivery KPI which is outside the company. So it's connecting the market to the delivery organization. So when the customer or the market reacts positively, then we are also reacting positively as a company. We have the same interest. So for you as a consulting business, try to find a KPI that can be measured, that actually combines value for you and your customer at the same time. It is possible, but it's a bit more challenging for the consulting industry than it is for a product company where it's quite obvious. With these words and this small teaser on North Star, go ahead, do it in your companies. Use the link in the PowerPoint here where you can find more inspirational information about this from one of the authors around this topic.
Yes. And thank you. Oh, we had a short run through here, but I think I'll just skip that because we, no matter how much we practice, we always have a lot to say. So the time is pretty much up. Just a few final words. Thank you all for coming. It was so nice to have you here. We have a few upcoming webinars. Talk about, we look into the SPI benchmark for 2021. How did the consultancy industry perform in 2020? And there are a few surprises in there. It's not as bad as you might think. If you have any questions, you can just at the end put them in the public chat here. We'll take them for those of you who can stay for a minute or two longer. Then on 9th of June, we have a webinar where Søren will go into depth with the project financials and say how can you really work with improving the finances of your project. So that one we also did last year, and it was really good, and I recommend you guys go there. The email you received afterwards will have a link to both webinars, so you can actually sign up in there. And at the end, we have a lot of this data from that supports this webinar from the 2021 SPI benchmark, which is a very comprehensive benchmark for the consultancy industry. We have 561 international companies and measuring 160 KPIs. And you can get this on our website. You get the full benchmark and you get the executive summary, and really recommend you dive into that. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So, with that being said, thank you all for coming, and have a very pleasant Wednesday. And for you, those of you who stay behind, if you have any questions, we can just take those. Thank you. Okay, we have one question from Mirsad. Is it possible to show the KPIs on project sites in TimeLog? Maybe Sasha or Søren, you could take this one.
Well, some of the KPIs you already have automatically calculated for you in some of the reports. I think we can help you find out which reports to dig into. There are also some KPIs already on the projects, so it depends on which one of them are interesting. But reach out afterwards, and I will be glad to help you with this.
I can maybe add that the most dominant project KPI we have available in the system today is, you can say, there's of course project contribution margin, but also the project factor, a KPI you can actually put on top of your project. So when you are in a project, you are directly having access to what's the profitability right now of this project with color codes and so on. So that could be a way to do it. Check out project factor. That would be one of the tools, I think.
Yeah. I could just add to this slide that you get the email afterwards directly from Sasha. So if you have questions to this, please just reach out, respond to the email, and of course we'll answer all your questions. And also, if you have any questions about KPIs and just want to have a bit of a deep dive in your company or just a chat, feel free to reach out. We're really looking forward to having good discussions with you. I think that was all for the questions. So I'll end this webinar. Again, thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.